Tonight's Weber Day program is the plain and colorful story of feed sacks. My friend and neighbor, Linzee Kull McCray, will share stories and images from her book, Feed Sacks, The Colorful History of a Frugal Fabric. Feed sacks and their repurposing is the perfect topic for a Weber Days program. My mother has shared the stories of her mother making dresses for her out of feed sacks. And I can recall some striped, very plain feed sacks that were towels when I was growing up. Like that one, only there was nothing on it, just the stripes, and others of you may have those memories as well. Our speaker tonight, Linzee McCray, is an award-winning writer and editor focusing on art, textiles, and crafts. She writes for magazines including Stitch, American Patchwork and Quilting, Uppercase, Quilts and More, Quilt Sampler, and more. She is the author of the recent work, Art Quilts of the Midwest. Please help me welcome Linzee.
Thank you, Maeve. I'm really pleased to be here during Irving Weber Days because when I went to graduate school, I graduated just 20 years ago. I went kind of late, and I did an internship for the Goldfinch, which was the State Historical Society's children's magazine. And I did a story I remember about roads, and I used Irving Weber's columns as part of my research. So it's really fun to be here to be able to do that. Maeve told you a little bit about me. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, except that I wanted to mention that I was a writer and editor for the university for about 13 years, and I started freelancing maybe about, it's been about 10 years that I started freelancing in quilting and that arena. And I'm not moving this forward. Bond? Do I just? Yeah, maybe. Oh, that way. That seemed backwards to me, but apparently. All right, so these are some of the places that I have written and still write for. And really what drives all of my writing is curiosity. I'm curious about things, and to me it's a great privilege to be able to then go ask people questions about them and to get to share that information with other people. And I am sharing this because when I was writing for Etsy, for their blog, and that was the first time I wrote about feed sacks. In 2010, Michael Zaz from Washington, Iowa, came to our quilt guild, and I was just blown away. I had never heard of feed sacks. I knew nothing about feed sacks, and I could not get over it. I just thought it was fascinating. So I started writing about them. I wrote for Etsy first, and then I wrote for, there's a French quilting magazine where I had a column, and I wrote for them. And then I also wrote for Uppercase. And I also, for Uppercase in 2010, I just kiddingly said, can you guys hear me still? Is there, okay. Would you ever want to do a book about feed sacks? And she said, well, I really like feed sacks, but I can't right now. So the next thing I did was I did the Art Quilts of the Midwest book. And that, again, was born out of curiosity. I was really curious how does a person's aesthetic how is it affected by where they live and what they see around them? And that's what this book was about. And again, curiosity about feed sacks. So my publisher, Janine, at that point said, I can't do it now. So then after that first book was done, I really wanted to do a book about feed sacks. It was in my head. And so I talked to another publisher who was interested, but I felt that I should contact my first publisher and just let her know because I'd talked to her about it. And she said, wait, we can do it now. So that was great, but the problem was she wanted the book out by December for the holidays, by November, and this was January. So it was pretty much of a rush. Fortunately, because I'd written about it before, I had experience. I had done a lot of research. But anyway, this is Mike Zaz in display. He used to do in the Ainsworth Opera House every year. I don't think he's done it the last few years. Right now, he's very involved with the Brinton Film Project. But he has hundreds and hundreds of sacks, and he would put them out for display the same weekend as the Kelowna Quilt Show. And then he would also put out all these items for display that were made from feed sacks. And he's a really interesting guy, and I've learned a lot about feed sacks from him. So what you'll be seeing here are some pages from the book, and the book is the colorful, C-O-L-O-U-R full, is because the book is published in Canada, so it has Canadian spelling. We have over 850 images. It's 544 pages. We had no idea that would happen, but as my publisher would text me, it's 325 pages. It's 462 pages. It's 544 pages. We just kept going. We couldn't stop ourselves. It was so much fun. So these are some pages that I'll show you from the book, but there are obviously many, many more. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of feed sacks, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we made the book. So feed sacks sort of came into being at around the time that the lock stitch sewing machine came into being, which was around 1845. Now there's some question about who designed the first sewing machine, but we're giving Elias Howe credit in 1845. There was something called the Sewing Machine Wars that went on for more than 100 years of people tweaking little things and getting patents, and so it's somewhat unsure. But the thing that was great about sacks, being able to store and carry things in sacks as opposed to barrels, which is what you see on the left, and that's what was used before, is that barrels took up a lot of room, they were unwieldy, they were heavy, just even by themselves, and aside from being empty, and they were hard to store. And a sack you could just take and throw over your shoulder, you could throw it over the back of a horse, you could stack them up, and so there really was a lot of value in being able to use sacks, and they became very popular, and there were a number of sack companies that came into being. One of the very first was the Chase Bag Company, and they invented a machine that helped fill bags more efficiently and make bags more efficiently. So on the left you see some of the ads for the flour that was in barrels, and one thing that you can see is that the logos on the barrels were those round tops. They used those because the shape was round, but when they moved over to sacks, they often just kept that round shape, which was really an echo of the logos that had been on the barrels. Eventually, they did take advantage of the full shape, the rectangular shape. The things that you see on the right are some little incentives, some needle books, a little scorecard, an ink blotter. So we found a lot of things to go with the feed sacks themselves. And what happened was that manufacturers, cotton was very, very cheap. And cotton was very, very cheap, number one, because most of it was produced by slave labor, in the 1840s and 1850s. And even after slavery was no longer a deal in the United States, there was sharecropping. And sharecropping was sort of another form of slavery. People were paid very, very poorly for cotton. So unfortunately, it does have that sort of sad history of why cotton was so cheap. So cotton manufacturers were really excited about bags. At one point, bags took up about 17% of all cotton grown in the United States was grown for bag production. But even as early as the 1920s, paper started coming in. And so cotton bag manufacturers wanted to work really hard to keep women interested in cotton bags. And so there's an incredible amount of interesting marketing stuff that they did, and we'll talk a little bit about that to keep that interest in cotton bags going. These are some designs from the Bemis Bag Company archives in Seattle, and I just think these are beautiful. I had a really hard time, as in I couldn't find almost any of the names of the designers. I really wanted to credit the designers because there's so many beautiful patterns and logos, and I have very, very few people that I was able to identify. But we did find this archive in Seattle, and we have a picture in the book of all of the designers at their drafting table, mostly men, a few women. And these are some of the designs that they were creating, and you can see the grids that are on there. And they were probably getting these ready to take to clients and show them and say, what do you think, or do you like this for your flower company? And feed sacks, they're just endless. I mean, if you go to these are from the Minnesota State Fair. Every year they have a big display of them. My sister took these pictures and sent them to me. It's incredible, and there's some really amazing graphics, and they're really fun to look at. So those are just some examples. So probably as soon as these bags became available, women started using them. Women figured out this is like free fabric, and they started using them. Now, you can tell that some of these have some pretty bright colors and a lot of printing, and probably a lot of the women who used them wanted them to be clean and wanted them to be more pristine, and it was very, very challenging to get the inks out. And there were all of these concoctions that people had of like Fellsnap the soap and lard and lye and like soaking it overnight. And there was even a southern tradition that if you did it on a full moon, the ink would come away more easily. You know, it was a big job. So that was one of the first things that manufacturers did, was they figured out that they would make the ink easier for women to get rid of. And here on the bottom is the Bemis Bag Company had their Bemis washout inks. And they printed right on the bag how you were going to get rid of it. And some of the bags over here have that on it. And then the other thing they did was they told you what you could use the bags for. Like this one tells you tea towels. I've seen one that says, you know, sew 4 of these together for a sheet, or, you know, that kind of thing. So they started trying to make them more user-friendly and help the women out as a way of keeping women loyal to cotton bags. The next thing they did, and this was probably in the 20s, they started printing embroidery patterns on them. And we found, you know, pillowcases where they would print just the border, and, you know, and here they tell you how to stitch first, then remove the ink, how to scrub it out. So there were all kinds of things like this. One of the other clever things were the days of the week towels. You know, they would say you would go to the store, your husband would bring back the sacks, and you would get like Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, and you'd be like, okay, honey, go back to the store and get Monday, Tuesday, whatever I missed, Saturday and Sunday. So again, it was a way of getting more of your product into people's homes, creating more demand. And when I talk about women sewing and men going to the store, it's a generalization, but it's a pretty good generalization. And it's interesting in talking to a lot of the people I interviewed, many women and children stayed on the farm a lot. Like they did not go into town a lot. It was the men who would go into town. I did talk to people who said they would get to go with their dad into town to pick the feed sacks for their clothes, and that was always a big deal. But it was often sending the husband into town with requests or instructions of what to get. The next thing that came along were the dolls, and there's actually a whole book that just came out last year by Gloria Nixon. I'm pretty sure the library has it, of just feed sack dolls, or these sort of dolls that you could cut out and sew and stuff and then stitch closed. And puppets, there were puppets. So there are all kinds of these things. But again, another way to keep people excited and interested about the product. And people would say the manufacturers would tell people the product or the bags are almost as important as what's inside of them to people, you know. So in the late 30s, or the mid 30s, excuse me, the Daleys tint sacks came in. And that was the first time when somebody colored bags. And they weren't just that plain white anymore. So these were some of the first ones, and you can see this one has a pattern for something on it. I'm not sure what an apron maybe, with the ties. But they came in a few colors, and that was a big, exciting change. And then there's a lot of question about who was the person who decided to do prints, dress prints on bags. But it's often credited to someone from the Percy Kent Bag Company. And sadly, after the book came out, I now have a connection with the Percy Kent family, and she's going to let me look at some of their records. But Richard Peake, who was a vice president there, supposedly was in a diner, and he saw these seat covers, or the seat back covers, and he thought, that were prints, and he thought, I bet we could do that with our bags. And he went home and encouraged people at the factory to try it, and it took off. There had been, in the 1927, there was a company that did gingham girl flour, but they only did red and white bags. That was it. And it was exciting for a while, but it didn't last. But the bags just started coming out in patterns and patterns. And these are a couple of ads that are from trade magazines, maybe, where they were trying to encourage someone who was selling seed or feed or flour to use print bags because they would keep people excited about the product. And this is really a big change because, you know, women did not have, and most women didn't have an income, but it became clear that they had a big say in how the family's income was spent when this kind of advertising came out. And Mike Zaz told me that he thinks this was maybe only the second time that there was marketing directed right at women like this. The first time being cough medicine. That was what his theory is. So, but although the prints were on the bag, there was still that darn label. They were printing right on the prints, and that was hard to get out. There's even a somebody like tried to get they wrote their senator about it. I have a copy of the letter, like we've got to make this change. And so again, to be more appealing to women, companies came out with paper labels. One of the first was the Bemis band label, and this is the patent we reproduced in the book. And the Bemis band label was basically sewn into the seam of the bag as it was sewn shut, and it was also pasted down. So, and then this was another thing, the paste companies would brag that their label came off in one piece, that it didn't come off in a bunch of little pieces to clog up your drain. So again, just anything they could think of to set themselves apart from the other bag companies. And I have one band label down there. And these are just some examples of different labels. They also just put them in the center, and then they would start doing other things to get people excited. Some people would put a little bit additional bag at the bottom to give you a little more fabric. Some people would put, some of you may remember the days when in your detergent boxes you would get dishes. Well, they would do things like that. Or they would put coupons in the bag. So there were all kinds of things they were doing. And again, just doing all sorts of different prints. These are a couple of little incentives, needle books. I got that one with the pig and the chick on it in Kelowna. I found that. Thimbles. And then that one is I think that one is one of the bags that has a little extra fabric on it. So we'll talk a little bit about what people did with these sacks. And there are a lot of names, feed sacks. Some people call them pretties. Some people call them chicken linen because there are a lot of chicken feed that was in them. There are whole cotton commodity bags. There are a lot of names for them. But clothing was one of the main things that people used feed sacks for. And Mike Zaz again made the point that in some homes, every single piece of fabric had been a feed sack, everything. And, diapers, curtains, tablecloths, dish towels, clothing. I interviewed one woman whose mother-in-law and her sister both used feed sacks during menstruation. And they said in the 1920s, there were menstrual pads were available, but they were expensive. And so this is what they used. So they were really, really invaluable. The average woman's dress took between 4 and 5 sacks. So often you would find men at the feed store with a swatch of fabric, and they'd been instructed to go back and get 3 more or 4 more. I also talked to someone who, when he was 16, he was able to drive the horse and buggy to the feed store himself, and he was so excited. And his mom always said, make sure you get 3 of the same pattern. She didn't care what it was, but to make a dress for his sister. And there's some it's really fun when you find these dresses. It's hard to know sometimes if they are feed sacks, but the really frugal women would sometimes hide the stitching, and you can come see on these. One of the best ways to tell if it really was a feed sack is that you will see little stitching holes. And even after they're washed, you'll see them, and come up at the end and take a look. And they would hide those stitching holes in the seam allowances. So you can sometimes find that. Again, to keep things going, they partnered with pattern companies, and these patterns, instead of telling you how much yardage you would need, this one says size 11 takes 3 sacks. So they designed patterns specifically to be used with feed sacks. There were all kinds of these books that came out that, and I forgot mine, but that talked about ideas of things you could do with feed sacks, and they tried to make them seem very glamorous. At one point, they even hired, this is the only named designer I know, they hired a New York designer, and they made a big deal out of it. Charles K. Barton, European trained, who lived in New York. And he supposedly came out to the Midwest to see how women were wearing them. The kitchen was a place where there were lots and lots of use of feed sacks. These are all pot holders. You can see here a little illustration of chair covers and curtains. I interviewed Florence Stockman, who lives in Iowa City, and she said that she remembers going to her grandmother's farm in Audubon, and during the harvest, she would help her grandmother. And she said, we didn't have saran wrap in those days. So her grandmother would bake all these biscuits and cakes and things for the hired hands, and they would just cover them all with feed sacks. And so there were lots and lots of kitchen uses aside from the towels that Maeve remembers too. And one of the most popular things, somebody was talking about aprons. And aprons were very popular in part because you didn't need as many sacks. So that was a good thing. And I have to say one thing I just love is when I find these is the attention to detail. That, it's like, this is like your apron. Although I think people wore aprons a lot more than we do now. But, there'd be beautiful like rickrack or, I don't know, they just took the time to make these everyday items, scallops. Yeah, really, really lovely. Children's clothes are very, very popular. Again, you don't need very many sacks for them. And again, the same thing, you would just find these sweet little embroideries or smocking, or just, they took that time to make this little dress, so special for their children. And there are boys' clothes and girls' clothes. And there are a lot of these juvenile prints that you see over on the right-hand side. And I have a few here that you can see. There's these girls sweeping, and they were very popular. They're very collectible now. And of course, quilts. And we have two really lovely examples. One of the interesting things about quilts is that we were talking about these quilts belong to Bond and Beth, where they really feed sack quilts. And one of the things about scrap quilts is that you can be pretty sure that you're going to find fabrics from decades over, in a scrap quilt. And that's true of at least the quilt on the left has very old fabrics, much older than feed sack era, and some that I think are feed sack. Beth, will you tell us how many pieces are in your?
6,100 and something.
6,100 and something pieces are in the quilt on the right, and you should go up and take a look at that. Just tiny, tiny squares. Those are often called postage stamp quilts, and an incredible amount of work has gone into that. There's a lot of the patterns of the era, the 30s and 40s, quilt patterns had a lot of pieces in them. And I thought it was because they had a lot of little scraps and they didn't want anything to go to waste. And that is true. But I was talking to Carolyn Ducey, who's one of the curators at the International Quilt Study Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, which, if you're interested in quilts, is a great place to go. And Carolyn said she thought it was equally as responsible, could be responsible, that quilters are just very competitive, because she said almost always when there was a story in the newspaper, which there often was, about a quilt, they would say how many pieces were in it, and then the next person had to have more pieces, so so there are quilts with an amazing number of pieces. This is another, from the book, this is another thing that I really like. This is a quilt made out of tobacco sacks. So this little sack on the left I actually found in Kelowna, and it's, about this big. And the quilt on the right is the collection of the Briscoe Center of American History in Austin, Texas, where I was lucky enough to go do a bunch of research. And a woman named Effie Rowe made it, and she dyed each of those sacks, and then she stuffed them and she stitched them together, and there are 550 sacks in that quilt. And I just love it. To me, it has this beautiful watercolor kind of effect to it that I think is so pretty. So again, quilts were, but everything came in a sack and was reused. Another thing that happened with these sacks were they were used for foundation piecing. So this quilt on the right has a lot of probably silks and fabrics that would ravel or tear easily. They're in uneven pieces, and so you sew them down to a foundation of some other firmer fabric, and they would just use, in this case, flour sacks. And I meant to say, sort of showing the back of the sacks, earlier on, that there's some great stories about, if you didn't have to get the ink out, you just didn't, because it was so much work. So women would often use these use sacks for underwear or undergarments. And there are a couple of very classic stories that get told about the young lady who was wearing her feed sack underwear with her new boyfriend, and she tripped and he saw Southern Best on her rear end. Or the wife that didn't bother to remove the flower label that said self-rising on her husband's underwear. So those are two of the favorite stories. But again, if you weren't going to see it, you just didn't bother to take that out. And it's funny because I talked to somebody who said that she had made a quilt and she worked really hard to get the ink out, and then it came back and she felt like the quilt was ruined. And I said, well, now it would make it so much more collectible because you would see that. But of course, she didn't want that. Small-town newspapers are really fun to read, and I got to do a lot of that. And the American Cotton Council, the National Cotton Council, and the American Bag Manufacturers were really good at placing these articles as news stories. And so these are all sorts of ways to save money in 1939 with cotton bags. They're just all suggestions. And one of my favorite newspaper stories was on the front page of a small-town Texas paper. It said something like, Japan surrenders, and then in the next column over it said, Mrs. Peebles makes a mattress cover. And she used feed sacks to make a mattress cover. And so they were both sort of equal level above the fold in the paper. Not only do people save the sacks, they save the string. And which I know, it's hard to believe, but when you pull that string out, I measured one, and I can't remember, I feel like it's 200 and some inches that you would get. So quite a bit of string. And people made doilies with them. Phyllis Rosenwinkel, who lives in Iowa City, I interviewed her. She said her family, they would tie plants to poles, they would tie packages. Her mom used that string to sew patches on her dad's work clothes. And I met one woman in Texas who told me that she knew someone who saved the string and knit socks out of them, which I just thought they would be very uncomfortable, and how would they stay up? But anyway, and so you need so much string. So people were just so industrious. And one of the sacks I have over here has the instructions on how to remove the string so that you could preserve it on it. The string that, yeah, right. I mean, you can see in some of these that are still sacks, you can come up and see that there's a string that's in here that's holding it shut. Yeah. So you can pass that around if you want. So sewing with sacks, again, paper bags were there in 1920s. Duplex bags, which are bags that have the sort of clear mesh on the front and paper on the back, were also there. They were becoming more popular. They were cheaper than than fabric bags, but they continued to try and keep cloth bags desirable. One of the things they did was in World War II, it was very hard to get any fabric, and the cotton bag manufacturers very cleverly got the government to call sacks for industrial use. And then so you were still able to get them, because most fabric at that time was really going for the troops and for the war effort. So you were able to use the sacks still. And so you see ads that would say, a yard saved is a yard for victory. And you were very patriotic if you were sewing. This piece of fabric is called from Percy Kent's United Nations cloth. Kent's cloth of the United Nations, and it included images of all the new countries that had joined the United Nations, as well as battle scenes and General MacArthur. And my favorite thing, my publisher wouldn't put on there because she didn't want this in the book, but there's a frying pan, and it has 3 eggs in it, and they're caricatures of Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler, and it says, "Bad eggs, keep them frying." And this feed sack is very expensive if you can find one. Every now and then I look on eBay and I'll see it, and they go way high, and I've never tried to get one. Feed sacks were produced in a lot of different colorways. They have the same print in different colors. These are from, over here on the end I have this feed sack came in blue and pink and yellow. So it's the same print, but all in different colors. And there's another one here too. And these are from the International Quilt Study Center, from notebooks that were collected by a collection by a woman named Charlene Brewer, who's from Oklahoma. And I got to meet Charlene when I was driving back from Texas in early March. And she has boxes and boxes and boxes of feed sacks in her garage. She's a lovely woman, and she donated 7 of these notebooks, great big notebooks of all of these feed sacks, to the International Quilt Study Center. And the volunteers took them off, and so they had been pasted down, sewed them all onto archivally correct papers, and it's really fun to look through those. And then these are just for your pleasure. In the back of the book, Janine, the publisher, and I, neither of us had a lot of feed sacks, but we both managed to accumulate some feed sacks during the process. And these are just some images of the fabrics. And was a woman in Florida named Pat Reed, and she kept notebooks also of samples. And her daughter told me that it used to be like in the back of like Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens. there were these swapping clubs, and you would send 10 samples of your sacks, swatches, 2 by 2, and then someone else would send you 10 of theirs. So she has a notebook, which you can buy the photocopy of, and it has 18,000 different prints. 18,000 different prints and colorways. And I asked her daughter, I said, well, were there more? And she said, we just stopped counting at 18,000. So it's very fun. So these are just some examples for you to take a look at. And it's interesting that nowadays you can find some of these reproduced. Fabric designers love them. This one on the top, the green sort of lacy one, I've seen reproduced exactly as it is. Oftentimes people will take the images and maybe change them around or change the colors, but they're still very popular. They were not patented and copyrighted. And so I know a fabric designer who looked into that carefully before she started doing hers. But and neither are they, we don't know who designed them. That's the other thing that I think is really sad, because they're so beautiful. They were also printed very cheaply and quickly, and people really kind of like that. It gives them, as one designer said, a woman named Denise Schmidt said, it gives them kind of a circus poster effect that she really likes. And so they're still, as popular in many ways as they were. And then these are cheater cloths that the bags were, sort of fake quilts. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how the book came to be. So I was in Austin, Texas, and it turned out that they had fabulous resources for feed sacks. The Briscoe Center for American History has 2 women donated these amazing collections. So I spent many days there and it was just such a treat. They would bring me these boxes, and it would be like Christmas, like what's going to be inside? University of Texas, it's their American History Center. And there are a number of feed sack collections around the country in libraries. There's a good one in West Virginia. I was actually just at the Smithsonian last week, and they have a feed sack collection. And they're the one at the Smithsonian isn't, but the Briscoe Center is. You just have to let them know you want it, because a lot of it's stored off-site, and then go and you are a researcher, you fill out some paperwork, and you can go see them. And the West Virginia one, I would imagine, is too. There's another place in Texas that has them. So anyway, she would bring these boxes, and we'd open them up, and there'd be like just these amazing things inside. Here's this beautiful feed sack with this great label. This one I thought was especially interesting. It's printed in Sherman, Texas, or the mill is in Sherman, Texas, but it's in Spanish. The label's in Spanish. This was another one of my favorite things. Everything that was in all these boxes had an accession card. And so everything was listed. And this was a wire coat hanger that was covered with a feed sack, so that was very fun. And there's also another thing you can see here, and I have brought one with me, which is this one, are border prints. So these are border prints, and you could use them for curtains, you could use them for a skirt, you could use them for a tablecloth, that kind of thing. That was another print. And then in addition to all of that, there were just these pages and pages of swatches. And she had arranged, this was Catherine McCready, she had arranged these all by color, and it was like heaven to get to just sit and look at these. And so I really, really enjoyed that. There also is a feed sack collection, a flour sack collection at our very own Hoover Library in West Branch. If you go out there, and many of you probably know, during the First World War, the Hoovers were really instrumental in helping to get flour to Belgium, and the Belgian people, as a thank you and also as a way to keep the cotton out of the hands of Germans, which I thought was very interesting because you could use it to make ammunition, practiced their embroidery and their lace making skills and sent these beautiful sacks back to the Hoovers. And apparently they displayed them in the lobby or in the foyer of their home for many years. And we have about 200 of them out here. Marcus Eckhart is the curator who helped me get these pictures taken. And then there are a number of them at the Hoover Center at Stanford too. But there are always some on display. If you go and just look at the museum exhibits, there's always some on display. So the question was, how are we going to get 850 images for this book? These are some of my feed sacks. I didn't have a lot. And so I was talking to people, trying to find people who had collections. Janine and I would go to antique stores. This was and we would buy ephemera like this ad, or we would buy feed sacks. And this is you can see this is on the seat of my car. I had been in a antique store and I found all these things, which are it wound up in the book, most of them. And I took a picture and sent it to Janine. Janine's in Calgary, Canada, so she and I only met twice during the whole process, and we did the whole thing through online, through Google Docs and Evernote. And we would Skype a lot. But I did finally find that there's a woman in Palmyra, Nebraska, Gloria Hall, who would let us use her collection. She was very gracious. And she invited us to her home. And so Janine and I met in Lincoln. And here we are at an event where we finally met. And the next day we drove out and we met Gloria. And Gloria's in her 80s, and this is her grandson, Paul Pugsley. And Paul also has a great feed sack collection. She's kind of given him the bug. And they're standing in front of a feed sack quilt in her hall. And they were so gracious. We thought we'd be there 2 days, and we ended up spending 1 day, and we ended up spending 2 8-hour days. I mean, they had so many things. They had so many feed sacks and things related to feed sacks, many of which are in the book. And I wrote a profile of them, and we've identified the things that were theirs. And when we got there, they had all of them out on tables. Like they put out these tables for us, and we were just sort of, in awe. And so we started just one at a time photographing them. And eventually, and if you look in the book, you'll see we did stacks of 3 because there was no way we were going to get them all photographed. And Janine and I, we shot all the photos with our iPhones, which I think is kind of amazing, another technological thing that's very amazing. But we ended up getting like dizzy because we would get down, shoot the picture, get up, get down. Finally we were getting up and down way too much. It was really funny how it just went on and on. It was unbelievable. So. And Gloria was also, in addition to the sacks themselves, she was really, really generous with her knowledge.
They are your editor in Canada. Did they have feed sacks such as these?
She ended up collecting some also during the process.
In their country?
Oh, no. There are feed sacks with labels that are Canadian, but the bags themselves, as far as we can determine, were only produced in the United States. They were, they might wind up in a quilt in Ireland or Australia because someone sent them to their sister, and there are some that were sent to Canada. But as far as we can tell, they were only produced in the United States. So, yeah. We also did these little rulers so that we would sort of have the scale and also know who owned the sacks. And in the front, in very tiny type, Janine, the publisher, has listed who owns each of the sacks that are in the book. And then this is how we would use a lot of them. Like this is that one I showed you over there. And then it would sort of be the backdrop for the table of contents. So they're sprinkled throughout the book, some by themselves, some as backdrops for other things. And there are a couple more that were backdrops. Yeah, right. Yeah, apparently even then. And this is my last slide, and I just include this because it really is what, to me, feed sacks and the book and why I have this love of them is about. And it's about women like Mrs. Alfred Peterson here, who, she's the wife of a tenant purchaser borrower in Mason County, Colorado. And, people like Mrs. Peterson were probably growing all this food, canning all this food, cooking for their families, cleaning without modern appliances, and maybe raising a lot of chickens because women often raised the chickens and had these sacks from the chicken feed. And then they would take the time to sew something, and they would make it beautiful often. And it just, to me, there's just a resilience that I admire so much about the women who did this. And one of the other things that's been really fun for me is as I've gone around and talked to people, and I hope tonight that I hear some more stories, but I hear these stories from people and about their memories of feed sacks, and they're almost all positive. I went home and I told my mom, have you ever heard of feed sacks? And she pulled out, and I have it over there, this shoe bag that I've seen my entire life. And she said, well, I made this out of a feed sack. She'd gotten at my aunt's farm. I had no idea. So these stories come out, and they're so fun to hear. But I had heard a lot that people did not feel good about feed sacks, that they felt like they were a sign of poverty. Almost no one I interviewed felt that way. Almost everyone had only one person actually, everyone else had really positive memories. Now, part of it might have been that they weren't this woman, they were her children. And so they were looking back with fondness. They weren't the ones doing the work as much, but they all said, we didn't feel poor. Everyone else was wearing these clothes made out of feed sacks. We loved them. We felt proud of these clothes. And it's just something that I really have so much admiration for. And I also think there's something very thought-provoking about, and at this age when we really appreciate sustainability, of thinking of a product that, everything that your flour, sugar, salt, everything came in could be reused. So it's something to consider. So that's it. If you have any questions.
I have tons of questions. I could just talk to you for the whole night, but we'll start out with somebody else.
How would you get the feed sacks?
That's a good question. Every now and then I would get lucky, and I would go into like an antique store or like Artifacts or a store like that, and they would have some for sale, or the Crowded Closet. I've gotten some on eBay. I've gotten some on Craigslist. So different ways like that.
Back then, how would they get them?
They would go to the store and they would say, I need some flour. And the flour would actually come in one of these sacks. And like that would have your flour in it, because people used to bake a lot more. Or it would have your chicken feed, or it would have your seeds for your field. Yeah, there Maeve is showing you a thing for feeding calves. So that's how they got them.
So that was one of my questions. I always thought of them as feed sacks, but they were flour sacks and seed. So seed corn would have come in them. And
Everything.
so was the weight of the sack heavier, stronger if you're buying seed corn, it's a heavier weight?
It was often more loosely woven. It didn't have to be as tightly woven. It wasn't necessarily a heavier weight. Some of them there were a lot of different weaves. I have this one, the weave is a little bit different, and you can tell it's a little heavier. The woman in West Virginia, in their collection, said they actually have some that are, mostly they were cotton, but there was rayon, and eventually that string became rayon rather than cotton. And she told me that they had some that were woven with metallic thread, and she said the girls really liked to use those for their prom dresses. So, but the one thing that is for sure is that the things that had like flour and sugar were more tightly woven than things like seed, so they would stay in. Yeah.
So I grew up with quilts that my grandmother had made and then my mother had made, and I always knew they had come from clothing, but I hadn't realized the lineage of the clothing. Probably a lot of it came from feed sacks, because it was, you never threw anything away. When my grandmother died, we still had zippers and buttons that had been salvaged
Taken
from
off of
clothing that had been cut up to make quilts. So, gosh.
And those fabrics went through. I mean, I interviewed a woman who talked about how when her little sister needed a dress, they would, it wasn't feed sacks, it was a coat. They would turn it inside out because it was less worn, and use the less worn side and remake it for the little girl, and then those scraps from that probably wound up in the scrap basket. And when you needed a piece or, a certain color or just were making a scrap quilt, out they might come.
Yeah, the frugality of the time. I mean, nothing was
wasted.
And you do have rubber band balls at home, so I don't understand why you think it's so odd that people would make string balls from their feed sacks. Are there other questions or comments? Oh, good.
I just had a question about the quantities, because when you were saying that women would have their husbands or sons go get 2 or 3 bags or find the 3 of the same pattern, then would they have these huge bags full of, like 3 huge bags full of flour? And how would they, I just wondered, like, how they were buying such huge quantities of these, and how they, especially with flour, like how they would keep it fresh.
Well, if you had 7 children and you were baking all of your everything, it would go pretty quickly. I also have heard stories about people who would say, I can't afford to buy 5 right now. Could you hold on to a couple for me? And they would keep them at the store, but probably the conditions weren't any better at the store than they were at home. So
Where did you get the fabric?
that's a really good question. The fabric, so most of the cotton was grown in the south of the United States, and the fabric was woven in the northeast. So like Massachusetts and that area, there were a lot of mills, and that's where the fabric was woven. A couple of the bag companies had their own mills, and they did the whole thing from growing the cotton to ginning it, getting it ready, weaving it, and making the bags themselves. And there's a town called Bemis, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but so that's a good question. Thank you.
I'll come back to you in just a sec.
I told my 81-year-old sister that I was coming here tonight, and she said to tell the story.
Okay.
That she was hired by the neighbor. We were farmers in Nebraska, and she was just to do housework. Maybe when she was 15, and she was paid in feed sacks.
No way.
And my mother was furious.
Well, it's interesting because what I've heard is that you could sell feed sacks for about $0.25 a piece. So if she had some way to sell them, maybe that would have been a good deal for her.
They used it, but
They used them, but yeah,
they thought they
should get cash.
Neighbor.
Yeah,
She could have paid.
she should have paid her. That's really
Do you have
interesting.
another question?
Because the feed sacks are so big, how would all of them, how would they eat so much of that?
Well, in those days, there was almost nothing that you bought. Like you would never go buy bread, or you would never go buy muffins, or you would never go buy biscuits, or you would never go buy cake. You would bake it all. And you might have a big family. People often had bigger families, and so they would use it. It's hard. Pardon me? And hired men. Yep. It's hard to imagine, but it's true.
How full would they fill the feed sacks?
Well, I think they went pretty full. I'm going to show you. Here's a smaller sack. This is a sugar sack. So you can see that sometimes the sacks were smaller too. And there were standard sizes. Early on, there were all kinds of crazy sizes. Excuse me. And at World War II, they standardized the sizes to make things easier during the war effort. So, excuse me. They would also be stitched. Yeah. And you can see the stitching lines. And that's how, if you're ever looking and you're trying to decide, is this a feed sack? Those stitching lines are probably your best bet. Yeah. Or else, these people like Gloria Hall know what's feed sack and what's not. After a while, you become kind of familiar, I guess, with the prints. And I know some of them, but not all of them. So.
Oh, hang on. Just
What designers from what companies have you talked to, like Moda and et cetera,
Who use feed sacks?
who you worked in, touched base with when you were doing all this?
Uh-huh. Well, I know, I actually work for Moda.
Okay.
So I
that's
know
what
a lot of the designers there, and some of them certainly, like Bonnie and Camille, base their designs on feed sacks. Denise Schmidt, who's a really well-known designer, hers are almost all feed sacks. That green one that I said, sort of lacy one, Anna Maria Horner reprinted that one. So a lot of very successful contemporary designers use feed sacks as they are, or they'll take a motif from them and use it, change it around a little. But they're very, very popular. Mm-hmm. Kim Kite from Cotton and Steel, she uses a lot of them. I don't know if you know her, but anyway.
So I have two questions.
Yes,
One is, was there an evolution in the design or the popularity of designs over the time that feed sacks were used?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I can't tell you exactly, except that I'm pretty sure they reflected the evolution of design all over, that they, over all textiles is what I'm trying to say. And one of the things I've heard is that the earliest feed sacks were small prints, and then things got bigger later. To me, you look at this, and this is just like 50s and 60s. It just does not look. Yeah, or today. Well, yeah, and many of them are coming back today. So I do think that the prints evolved. It's also, I can't find proof of this, but I've heard it over and over, that a lot of this yardage also just wound up in fabric stores. That it was printed and they used it for feed sacks and they used it for clothing, and you could buy it off the bolt. So they were popular style, fabric designs of the day.
And my second question is, could you just talk a little bit about when and why this stopped, the feed
Good
sack
question.
stopped being used?
So this stopped in the early 60s, probably 62, 63. And even by then, it was really fading, but that was when the very last feed sacks were printed. There is a company in Kansas called Hubco, and I had some bags from Hubco. They're still printing feed sacks, and that's about the only place in the United States. And the publisher, the first 1,000 books, people who pre-ordered them, or all the pre-ordered books came in an actual feed sack from Hubco, which was pretty cool. And what was the other part of your question, Heidi? Oh, why it stopped. Yeah, so it gradually just became less and less. People were buying, not buying in bulk, or farm people were able to buy things in bulk and not having to get these individual amounts. They could take a truck and get their truck full of seed or whatever. So the buying things in this way changed too, and that was part of it. And they started buying store-bought cake. Women re-entered the workforce. They weren't doing, as much baking. And the other thing is, we've talked a lot about rural feed sacks, but city people could use feed sacks too, because like bakeries would get all of their flour and stuff in feed sacks, and then they would sell them. That would be sort of a little sideline that they would have. So.
I have a couple questions too. First one, I'm sorry if we missed it in the beginning, but when did the patterns start becoming?
The patterns started in probably around 1937. There were some in the 20s, but they were only this one red and white gingham, and they didn't really last for.
So before that, they were just plain kind of
They were plain, and then there
cotton.
were solid colors in the mid 30s.
Okay.
But yeah.
Before that, were they always cotton before that, or?
Cotton was. I mentioned early on that cotton was very cheap because of slave labor and sharecropping and that sort of thing kept the costs down. And so there was a lot of inexpensive cotton. And so that was really what was used the most.
Okay. Next question is, in terms of colors and patterns, are there any trends over time or for different products?
Well, I think that's kind of what Heidi was saying, and I think the fabric trends kind of reflected the general trends in textiles that people were interested in their homes and in their clothing. This is another one that I think things were littler early on, like maybe this might have been sort of a sweet little earlier kind of feed sack. Something, I just love this one. I think it's so crazy. It's oak leaves and acorns, these bigger patterns really appeal to me a lot. And I think they probably are a little bit later. This is another one that I just think is crazy. And I would guess it's probably a later pattern. Go ahead.
It's printed, not woven.
It's printed, yeah. It's printed. And there are lots and lots of plaids. I don't have a plaid, but this one, I guess. Were very popular. Now, this one's probably not a man's shirt, but there were some that were definitely more manly kind of patterns and colors. It's printed on both sides? It's printed, just on one side. Yeah. So the inside is just like a piece of fabric. This might be a more manly pattern. I don't know. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. One last question.
Sure.
Were sewing machines common at this time in rural households?
Yes, so sewing machines, they were invented, in the 1840s, and I'm not going to be able to tell you the date of when sewing machines got to be really popular. Maybe someone could Google that, but Singer actually, Elias Howe, whatever his first name was, Singer was the first person. He did the layaway plan. He invented the layaway plan so that women could have their own sewing machines and really encourage them to have their own sewing machines. So yeah, a lot of homes had sewing machines. It was a common thing. Yes.
Wait,
Oh, we have to have the
they
microphone.
had treadle sewing machines too.
Then
It's-
treadle sewing machines, yep, before the electric ones.
Do they use sewing machines with those sacks?
Yes, there were big industrial kind of sewing machines that sewed these sacks up. That's right. So,
Well, this has been so much fun, Lindsay, and you had obviously so much fun in doing this
I did.
project.
I'm still having fun.
And I think we could probably talk for hours and hours and hours on all this fabric, and to be able to see it must have just been a wonder for you. So thank you very much. Please help me thank Lindsay for this program.
Thank you.